Hi class, I promised a post-election polling bias update. So this is going to be part of our lectures where we have some looking at the US election and it's the effects of polling bias is what we decided we would observe, right? We would see how much the polling bias was similar to the last election. Unfortunately, I have to make this the first post-election update because it's November 6th in the morning and the election still isn't called. It's kind of ridiculous that it's been going on all of these days. I wanted to do an update sooner, but there was even more ambiguity in the results. So there's going to have to be a follow-up one where I can do a proper statistical analysis because I can't do it yet when all the votes haven't been counted yet. That said, we can take a look at where we're at with the election and compare the results of the election so far to what we had predicted and whatnot. Well, making a call on the election wasn't actually the primary point of this endeavor. That was just an added little bonus that we could do for fun in the context of observing whether or not polling bias from 2016 would repeat itself on a per state basis, and if so, how closely. We can't quite answer that question yet, but we can at least do a rough picture of looking at everything. So I'm going to bring up my slides from last time. We're going to do a bit of a comparison, see how we're at, where we're close, and where we're far off. All right, so the national picture was that Biden was going to win by 7.4% nationally. That's the popular vote across the whole country. What really matters is those electoral college votes, but this was the prediction, 7.4%. I'll put my laser pointer on, right? 7.4%. So, it was 7% in September. It went up to 10.6% when Trump got COVID. It came back down to 7. The lowest I ever saw it in the last 6 weeks was a difference of about 6%. Biden leading by 6%. So far, Biden's only winning by not even 3%. So that is a really massive drop in the national prediction, right? Or put another way, the bias, the difference between what the polls predict and what actually happened got bigger. It was quite a lot bigger on the national picture, on the national scale. But what's really going to matter in the election is where the polling bias changes on a per state basis. And we can't do a complete picture of that yet, so that's going to be a follow-up case. Right, we talked about how Biden has lopsided regional support, right? And that because he has so much lopsided regional support compared to Trump, he has a big statistical barrier associated with his re-election. That statistical barrier that's associated with his re-election is quite large, and as a result, I predicted that this was a very tight race, right? I've said that many times all throughout the term. This is a much tighter race than the pollsters are saying. The pollsters kept saying that Biden was going to blow out this election, is going to win by a mile, and they were obviously incorrect, right? And we look at first at polling bias in each state. So there's going to be within the coming week or two, whenever the results are finally settled across all the states, we're going to take a look at how this picture changed, right? Whether the underlying trend of big polling bias in favor of Trump in a lot of Trump-supporting states holds, and whether or not things like California outperform for Biden relative to what the polls said. Early results seem to indicate that there is this general trend, but we have to go back and look at and do a thorough analysis. So we're going to be doing that in a bit. But right now we get to look at how close we are in the call to what is actually happening. So as we said, if we trust the polls, Biden would have swept to a super victory. But the polls were obviously not correct because he didn't sweep to a super victory. It's really tight, right? And I've been observing those polls and noticing that they fluctuate a lot, right? Which is a bad sign for their quality. Well, another bad sign for the quality of the polls is that they predicted Biden would win by 7.4%, and he's only winning by not even 3% in the national vote. That is a big difference. Hillary Clinton in the previous election only underperformed the polls by 1.3 points, 1.3%. Right, so what we have here is a tight race. So I said, hey, what do the pollsters agree upon? Well, the pollsters agreed upon this electoral distribution, that Biden had a lock on 290 cases, and he had a solid shot at a bunch of the remaining 85. Right? And I adapted this and said, well, I don't think that's likely. If you adjust for polling bias, a whole bunch of crazy things happen. Right? Things like Iowa, Ohio, and North Carolina are pretty much always in Trump's favor. Minnesota had a gigantic polling bias in the last election. It was like 9.4% or something like that. And so it was because of that that I predicted that Minnesota would flip and become become Trump territory. But that didn't happen. In fact, the polling bias, the difference between the polls and truth of the vote in Minnesota, narrowed dramatically compared to the previous election. We don't really know why. I think that might put Minnesota as a bit of an outlier in the election, but we're going to see when we finally reproduce that plot from the earlier slides where we break every state down for its polling bias. So we're going to reanalyze Minnesota in much more detail, figure out why try to figure out why the polling bias became so much smaller than in the previous election. Additionally, I said that these various states were flip-flopping. Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Texas, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so they became our swing states. Right, so far on the map, my predictions based on polling bias have the mistake of Minnesota. Right, and then I said, okay, well, I went with Nebraska's 2nd district being poorly polled, and therefore it might be a swing district, so I put that in the swing district category, and we ended up with a situation like this. So in other words, we were saying based on these swing states, it would appear that Biden is in the lead, but it is an open race. And then I said, okay, well, let's take a stab at calling the election, right? So this is based on my qualitative observations of how often a state was flip-flopping between the two candidates, if it was more often in one or the other, mixed with historical precedents and historical observations of U.S. politics. So I put Wisconsin, Georgia, and Texas into the often predominantly being in Trump's favor. Wisconsin is another case, like its neighbor Minnesota, that in the previous election had a very large polling bias in favor of Trump. And the polling bias shrunk a little bit. It was still, from the looks of it, a very large polling bias in favor of Trump, but Trump ended up losing by Wisconsin by a little bit. It's been called. I put Georgia and Texas into Trump's column, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Michigan into Biden's column. Pennsylvania I almost never saw in Trump's favor after the polling bias adjustments. But it did happen a few times in the term so far. So what's happened is that Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are my main state calls that were incorrect. But note that Minnesota has an electoral college value of 10, so does Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania has an electoral college of 20. So in other words, they cancel each other out, because I had said Pennsylvania is likely to be Biden territory, and it switched to Trump, and I said that these two are likely to be Trump territory, and they switched from that model to Biden. So they sort of canceled each other out, these three state-based mistakes. And then the only mistake remaining turns out to be Nebraska's 2nd district, right? The polls were predicting it's 3% in favor of Biden, but I still haven't been able to see the actual vote tally count for the region. Whenever I do a search for it, people don't seem to be publishing it. They're just publishing the overall Nebraska results, So Nebraska is one of those weird cases where you have this tiny little district that's the suburbs of Omaha. So at any rate, I completed the trying to assign everything, and I found Florida one of the hardest ones to call. I watched the election results come in, and Florida kept flip-flopping with one person in the lead, then the other person in the lead, and then Trump pulled ahead and won by a lot. So in other words, the polling bias in Florida has definitely gotten bigger. And so that's something of interest, right? We're going to want to track where the polling bias has gotten bigger and where it's gotten smaller, and maybe try to figure out why. If we can, that'll be really interesting. At any rate, my underlying educated guess or hypothesis was that the end score would be 269 to 269. Now, what happens in a tie? Then I went on to say, well, in a tie, the Republicans would be favored, and Trump would probably win re-election, but it's going to take a long time, right? The whole process is going to be dragged out over a long period of time, and it's going to be obnoxious. And we're going to have to wait for the House of Representatives, that is Congress, the congressmen and congresswomen, to vote on things, right? Well, that seems to be incorrect, like that this isn't actually going to happen. But it's remarkable how close I was in so many ways, in that we don't have to worry about the Congress. I'll skip ahead of all of the Congress things. But if we were to go back to 270towin.com right now, this is early in the morning on Friday morning, this is what they're reporting, 270 to 268. So note that relative to my predictions, I was off by 1 electoral college vote for each candidate, and which is nice and close. The end winner, of course, is Biden instead of Trump, which is welcome, assuming that holds when all of the counts are done on account of Trump being a bully and whatnot. At any rate, Nebraska's 2nd district is the definitive change in the numbers, although I did miscall 3 states that canceled each other out. Now, in my opinion, most people, when they're trying to call an election, this is the first time I ever tried anything remotely like this. When most people are calling an election, they usually have, some serious bias, right? We've talked about bias in this course. Bias as in you really want one person to win. And when you really want one person to win, we end up being biased in favor of outcomes that are what we want to end up happening, right? So in other words, if a pollster is really biased in favor of wanting Biden to win, then they might be much more inclined to call the election in such a way that Biden would end up with well over 300 electoral college votes. In fact, some pollsters were even going so far as to saying it was going to be such a big blowout in Biden's favor, he might win 400 electoral college votes to like Trump's 158 or whatever that would be. They were obviously very wrong, and the pollsters were very, very wrong. And my predictions were not that far off. Even if I was leaning towards Trump scraping his way through this system, and it looks like he's not. So currently, I'm off by 1 electoral college vote for each candidate. It's noteworthy that Nevada hasn't been called, but it's leaning Biden, and North Carolina and Pennsylvania haven't been called, and they're leaning Trump. And up until the end of the day yesterday, Georgia still hadn't been called, and it was leaning Trump. But now they're within like hundreds of votes of each other in Georgia. So if Biden were able to take Georgia, then I would be wrong in 1 additional state, and Biden would go up from 270 to something like 286 or something. I can't remember how many votes there are in Georgia, 14 or 16 or something like that. Anyway, even if that were to happen, it's still a tight race, unlike what all the pollsters said. And I was incorrect on Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, but they canceled each other out. Incorrect on Nebraska's 2nd district. So it's important to note that that's 4 regions, right? There are 50 states in the United States, plus the District of Columbia, plus I think 5 additional districts. There's Nebraska's 1st and 2nd district, and Maine's 1st, 2nd, and district. And Nebraska's 3rd district. So there's 5. I think it works out to be 55 or 56 total districts or regions in America that all contribute an electoral college vote. And I was wrong on 4 of them. So right on all but 4. And furthermore, I was incorrect in a what we might call an unbiased way. hopefully indicating minimal prediction bias on my behalf, right? I didn't want Trump to win, right? So I guess we have a little bit of bias there. But then I also felt that the statistics were a bit too big a barrier, or a big barrier for Biden. And so that's a bit of bias too, because as a person who does a statistical analysis, you want your analysis to be correct. So that's why earlier in the course I said, hey, looks like this is a win-lose or a lose-win situation here, right? I'm either going to win the statistical analysis and lose, who I'd want to be president, or I will lose my statistical analysis and win whom I want to be president. Somehow this outcome is somehow coming out as a bit of a win-win. I mean, it wasn't a perfect prediction at 269 to 269 with a Trump win, following up in Congress. But instead, it's pretty close to a correct win. I predicted that it was way tighter race relative to the pollsters, and I predicted within one electoral college vote of the current estimate. I also predicted it would take a long time to sort out the election, but due to Congress. Instead, it looks like it's going to take a long time to sort out due to voter fraud allegations in the courts. So if you haven't heard, Trump has launched many, many court cases in different states alleging various forms of voter fraud and things like that. Apparently, he has been rejected in almost all of those cases. However, at least in the case of Arizona, he has filed a claim, I heard last night, that there are 10,000 dead people in Arizona voted presumably through the mail-in ballots. So if that actually is not just Trump shooting his mouth off, and it turns out to be true, right? They turn out to have evidence of that, because it wouldn't be very hard, right? They get a record when you vote about who the people are who voted, and if somebody just takes that voters list and cross-lists it with the list of deceased people, you would be able to get a list of all of the dead people. And so then it was like, whoa, did that actually happen? We don't know yet. It's going to be this big drama that's going to unfold, and we're going to wait and see what the results are. And of course, if that were to happen in other places, it might be able to affect the election. In Arizona, the difference between the candidates 45,000 votes right now, as when I checked this morning, and we're talking about 10,000 possible dead people voting. Right, so then it's like, who are those dead people voting for? I don't know. It might be for everybody, right? It might be that you get a voter letter in the mail that allows you to do a remote voting, and a person is dead, and the person who's their relative decides, oh, well, I'm going to vote for the candidate I prefer on behalf of my dead relative. I mean, that could have actually happened. I don't know. And Biden is heavily favored in the mail-in votes overall, because Biden and the Democrats supported the practice of mail-in voting when the Republicans were not supportive of it. So the rate of successful voting for Biden is much higher in mail-in votes. So I don't know. We're going to wait and see what happens in the courts. Hopefully, hopefully there's not major voter fraud that would have affected the election, and hopefully the courts will be able to sort that out in a timely manner. But sorting things out in a timely manner is not exactly what courts are known for. So we may have to watch this unfold in a painfully slow manner. At any rate, once the final numbers are in, I will go back to the previous early slide that shows every state and shows the polling bias in each state, and we'll create a new plot and compare the two and see where things are the same and where things are different, which is ultimately what we set out to do when we decided to use this case as a demonstration for doing what amounts to a prospective observational study to see if 2016 polling bias follows through in the 2020 election and thus affects election results. Our early results were that if polling bias were to repeat, that the race between the two candidates becomes a very, very tight race. And that broad prediction has proved to be correct so far. So anyway, we will follow up some more later. Thanks.